All right, good morning. I'd like to call this hearing to order. Access to capital continues to remain a top concern for American small businesses, nowhere more than rural America, which has been slower to recover from the recession of '08, et cetera. Although venture capital has become a popular financing mechanism for small businesses trying to expand, data shows that more than 75% of venture capital goes to just 3 cities in the United States. This means that there are great small businesses, ideas that are frequently overlooked in my district in Virginia, Mr. Evans in Pennsylvania, and across the country. This issue is compounded by the fact that the decline in community banks has adversely impacted rural areas as well. According to community bank data from the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, there are 625 rural counties in the United States without a community bank based in their county. While this committee and my subcommittee have performed rigorous oversight to ensure that SBA's funding programs can be a resource for small businesses that cannot obtain credit elsewhere, today's hearing focuses on private sector solutions to address small business capital access. I want to thank Chairman Blum for co-chairing, thank you, Rod, this hearing to examine this important issue. Today's witnesses are working to bring together small businesses and entrepreneurs in rural America with private investors. While there is a learning curve for both, these organizations are working with trade associations, land-grant universities, local economic development organizations, and others to help bring those with capital together with those who need it to impact local economies and businesses. When these partnerships work, both the small businesses and the investors can benefit. It's a true win-win. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about private sector solutions to the financing gap for small businesses, and also to their suggestions about how Congress can help or stay out of the way. I now yield to our ranking member of the Subcommittee on Economic Growth, Tax, and Capital Access, Mr. Evans, for his opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. The resolve of the American entrepreneur was to put to the test following the Great Recession. Credit was slow to return to the small business sector, where 70% of all new jobs are created. Today, most economic indicators show sustainable growth, but rural and traditional underserved sections like women and minorities continue to face challenges accessing the capital need to start and growing small businesses. The reason for uneven access are many. Venture capital and private equity, which help high growth small businesses scale up quickly, is highly concentrated and shuns most rural and underserved markets like some in North Philadelphia. Similar, an uneven economic recovery has seen less bank capital being made available to women, minorities, and rural small businesses. This trend can be seen by using the SBA data as a proxy for the broader small businesses lending market. Less than 3 to 10 loans go to those who self-identified as minority. Similar, 7 in 10 loans go to male-owned firms. Earlier this year, committee Democrats held a series of roundtables to better understand the issues facing traditional underserved entrepreneurs. One focused on how to better deploy SBA lending programs like 7A and 504 loans. Another focused specifically on the lack of diversity, both demographically and geographically, in the venture capital industry. I think the broader takeaway from those meetings was that a holistic approach needs to be taken with significant investments by both the private and public sector. Today's hearing will further shed light on the issues these communities face and help build the public record on possible solutions. The witnesses panel represents some of the most leading-edge thinkers and investors that are crafting new and innovative ways to spread needed capital more demographically across the country. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on how to help the millions of entrepreneurs and small business owners that deserve an opportunity but are currently shut out through no fault of their own. Unlocking the potential of these hardworking Americans are potentially adding trillions to our economic output and providing hundreds of thousands of good-paying jobs in communities that need them, most like some of those in Philadelphia. I want to thank the chairman for holding this important hearing and look forward to your testimony. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dwight. I'd now like to yield to the chairman of the Subcommittee on Agriculture, Energy, and Trade, Mr. Blum, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Bratt. This Congress, I chaired a series of subcommittee hearings focused on revitalizing rural America. I'm pleased to join with Chairman Bratt today to focus on issue that is very near and dear to me, and I hope everyone in here as well, investing in rural America. At two previous subcommittee hearings on agricultural technology and innovations, witnesses emphasized the importance of entrepreneurs and farmers working together so that both small businesses and small family farms will benefit from the emerging technology and innovations. While innovation and technology is one important component of rural prosperity, witnesses at those hearings also highlighted another important component, economic development. Small businesses and entrepreneurs must be able to access capital so they can continue to operate and expand their businesses and also attract talent, dollars, and jobs to their communities. While other committee hearings have focused on oversight of the SBA funding programs, our witnesses today will highlight success stories of other groups and organizations who are driving private investments to rural America through initiatives and partnerships with a wide variety of stakeholders, including Iowa State University, which is a partner of Rural Opportunity Initiative, represented today by Mr. McKenna. Investing in and growing rural America is vital not just to citizens who live there, but also to the future of our country. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today, and I yield back my time to Chairman Bratt.
Thank you, Rod. I now yield to Ranking Member on the Subcommittee on Agriculture, Energy, and Trade, Mr. Schneider, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to welcome the witnesses. Since the Great Recession, local economics in rural America have been struggling to stay competitive in the 21st century global economy, losing business and people, especially young people, to metropolitan areas. While urban businesses experience record profits and a tight job market, rural counties have yet to fully recover from the lows of 2008-2009. As more and more people move to urban areas to find better opportunities, Congress must seek ways to help rural communities attract the resources to invest in small businesses. As a consequence of the financial collapse, rural businesses seeking capital remain at a disadvantage. Over 1,900 small local banks that would otherwise dispense that capital have closed down since 2009. Significantly, 78% of venture capital is concentrated in just 3 states, New York, Massachusetts, and California. And even these states, it's concentrated in the major cities. Because of this, over half of firm creation has been centered in only 5 metropolitan areas, where access to broadband, an educated workforce, and necessary infrastructure have rapidly outpaced their rural counterparts. Even though their geographic location requires sturdy roads and high-speed internet, rural America infrastructure has been neglected due to the scarcity of capital. Their decreasing population means a smaller tax base and therefore not enough money to educate the future workforce. Meanwhile, President Trump's scattershot trade war threatens the heart of rural America. Our agricultural industry is threatened with billions of dollars in retaliatory tariffs, risking thousands of rural jobs and millions in profit, all while producers face years of low crop prices. That is one reason I introduced H.R. 6396, which would expand the trade adjustment assistance to firms to help our local businesses damaged by these tariffs. Despite the challenges, the millions of people living in rural communities in all 50 states still hold that distinctive can-do American spirit. In fact, rural counties have the highest rate of self-employed business owners in the nation, and those businesses are resilient, averaging a better 5-year survival rate than their urban business counterparts. Although rural Americans build strong businesses, they still need to access capital to start them. Our guests here today have worked to bridge the divide between rural and urban growth. Whether providing loans to agricultural business or connecting entrepreneurs to investors, these witnesses have discovered strategies that can regrow our rural economies. I look forward to hearing what each of you have to say and discussing what federal policymakers can do to help. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. If committee members have an opening statement prepared, I ask they be submitted for the record. I'd like to take a moment to explain the timing lights for all of you with us today. You will each have 5 minutes to deliver your testimony. The light will start out green. When you have 1 minute remaining, the light will turn yellow. Finally, at the end of your 5 minutes, it will turn red. I ask that you try to adhere somewhat to that time limit. I'll give you a little variation. I'd now like to introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is Mr. Matt McKenna. Mr. McKenna is an executive in residence at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University, where he leads the Rural Opportunity Initiative, a partnership between McDonough, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Purdue University, Iowa State University, and Mississippi State University. I look forward to hearing your testimony, and you may begin. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, and good morning, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Blum, Mr. Chairman Bratt, ranking members, and members of the committee. People keep track of numbers pretty tightly when it comes to venture capital. And in just the first 6 months of 2018, over $57 billion have been invested in venture capital across America, $57 billion. Yet, as we've heard already this morning, only a small fraction of those dollars found their way to funds and companies based in rural America. This capital deficit, and it is a deficit with respect to rural America, is starving innovative and valuable growth opportunities. Without it, job growth and rural economic development will continue to lag the rise in prosperity that the rest of the country has enjoyed. The Rural Opportunity Initiative is a partnership housed at Georgetown University. And while Georgetown University often lacks real rural roots, our partners don't. Our partners are the Department of Agriculture, our friends at Iowa State, Mississippi State, and Purdue. Together, this group has embarked on an effort to increase investment from the private sector in rural America, part of America that, as we know, is almost 95% of the country in land mass, yet only 20% of its population. It is well established that small businesses, and particularly new small businesses, are the greatest source of job growth in the country. Yet these new businesses often lack access to critical sources of capital. The Rural Opportunity Initiative was organized to address this imbalance. Together with our partners, we have begun by organizing events that bring together both investors and entrepreneurs. At Iowa State, recently in Des Moines, we held an event that attracted dozens of small businesses, small Iowa businesses, together with potential investors, including regional venture capital funds and large institutional banks. Last month, we held a similar event down in Starkville, Mississippi, where we listened to pitches from new businesses that range from a microwave sensor technology developed on campus at Mississippi State. That technology detects spoilage in grain elevators. The other end of the spectrum, the other end of my spectrum, was a business that made healthy crackers using flour that was a byproduct of craft beer. And there was a lot of craft beer down in Mississippi, and those crackers were pretty good. Also on our schedule, though, for the rest of the year are events on Georgetown's campus around rural lending and expanding our partnership with USDA. And in November, we will be hosting a major conference on campus around rural capital and how dollars flow to investments in markets away from the coast. This conference, the Rural Capital Forum, scheduled for November 15th, will identify both hurdles to capital access and tools available to overcome those obstacles. And let me discuss just two of those obstacles this morning. The first is clearly a lack of awareness. We need to introduce the innovation and emerging technologies that are growing in rural America to institutional investors. This is the primary purpose of our investor conferences that we held in Des Moines and Starkville, and it will be the central theme for our much larger meeting this November. Other examples are well publicized. Steve Case from AOL has a very famous tour called The Rise of the Rest, which is going from town to town in rural America talking about innovation and investment opportunities. Another comes this fall when the Walton Family Foundation is hosting a major event in Bentonville, Arkansas around rural economy and rural innovation. But awareness building is only the opening of the door to the investment decision. Other more significant barriers remain. Chief among these is the issue of scale. Most rural businesses are small businesses. They are not looking for hundreds of millions of dollars. They are looking for $500,000 or $2 million of initial financing, money that is essential to the development of a business plan, initial working capital, and operations. Yet when the numbers get to be this small, there are few organized sources for this type of capital. One way of addressing this issue of scale is the development of funds that target this level of investment. The recent wave of rural business investment companies, RBICs, is a good example. Their charters limit their investments to rural-based businesses, and the typical investment slice has been typically in the $1 million to $5 million range. Another tool is a fund-of-funds approach, where many small funds are brought together by institutions as a way of allowing their customers to obtain the diversity and scale that is denied them in more targeted funds. And at Georgetown, we've been working with 2 big banks in New York to arrange these fund-to-fund approaches. And finally, there is a role for the federal government. And there's a role for Congress as well in tackling some of the obstacles that exist. And let me just talk about 3 of these paths forward from the federal government side. The first is the Rural Business Investment Company. Under the authority of the Department of Agriculture, the recent wave of RBICs has been impressive. By my count, several $100 million have already been raised in these funds. More are in line and waiting approval. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the incredible contribution, not just from USDA, but also from CoBank, one of my fellow panelists. CoBank has been a leader in establishing the RBIC and funding some of the RBICs, and their wisdom and guidance has paid very real dividends for small businesses in America. In addition, we have the recent tax bill that created an opportunity zone, the opportunity zones that are being provided to shelter some capital gains from investments. The opportunity zones are working their way through the system right now. They are a tremendous opportunity, I feel. And as I've looked over by my count, over 23% of the zones identified by the states are rural-based. So that's a significant piece of the opportunity zone legislation will be directed to rural America. More to come on that, I hope, in the future. Finally, the pending Farm Bill has a provision which I think is important for rural America. The Senate side, S5034, is a provision and an opportunity to spur even more investment into rural communities. We think this is a good thing, and we urge the House conferees to join the Senate in this effort. These pushes from the federal government are certainly important, but my role, and certainly the role of my role at Georgetown and with my partners, is to focus on the primary source of change, which I think is going to come from the private sector. We know these dollars are available, $57 billion in the first half of this year alone. But the challenge is how to change the direction of these investments, to channel them towards geographies where venture capital has not been well represented. That is ultimately a challenge of building awareness of those investment opportunities. This is where the Rural Opportunity Initiative and our partners are heading. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. McKenna. We appreciate your testimony. Our second witness is Ms. Fallon Donahue. Ms. Donahue is the CEO of Venture Ohio, headquartered in Columbus, Ohio. Venture Ohio's mission includes increasing capital access for Ohio entrepreneurs. Ms. Donahue served our country in the Ohio Air National Guard. Thank you for your service. And is an active member of the Columbus Chamber of Commerce. We welcome Ms. Donahue and thank you for your service. You may begin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Bloom, and ranking members and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony for this important hearing this morning. I'm honored to represent Venture Ohio's members who are innovating and creating high-paying jobs in communities throughout the Midwest. On behalf of these incredible entrepreneurs, innovators, and investors, I'm excited to share with you the momentum building in America's heartland. The Midwest is in the midst of a renaissance. As smart robotics and industrial automation proliferate, the Midwest is as reliant on innovation and research and development as our friends in Silicon Valley. Our brightest minds are electing to stay in Columbus, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and other growing cities across the Midwest, and no longer feel they need to leave for a coast to work at a thriving tech company. The Midwest is earning a reputation as a promising new frontier in venture capital investing and entrepreneurship. For the past few years, AOL co-founder Steve Case has been traveling alongside renowned author J.D. Vance and shining a spotlight on innovation in overlooked communities. Their $150 million Rise of the Rest seed fund has supported promising companies and communities throughout the Midwest. Another supporter of the region, Columbus-based Drive Capital, has raised over $500 million to invest in growing businesses throughout the Midwest. The publication TechCrunch recently noting the firm is spurring an investment revolution in areas of the country that are more synonymous with tractors than with technological innovation. Venture capitalists build ecosystems and support the key drivers of economic development: innovation, talent, and capital. Columbus-based NCT Ventures funded and helped to launch the Center for Entrepreneurship at The Ohio State University to inspire and educate entrepreneurs for generations to come. In Detroit, legendary entrepreneur Dan Gilbert and his team at Detroit Venture Partners have sponsored numerous accelerators and startup activities to stimulate innovation in the Motor City. The ripple effects of these investments in underserved areas are profound, supporting workers in high-paying jobs and their families and communities. But despite this promising momentum, America's heartland is lacking the critical access to capital enjoyed in Silicon Valley, New York, and Boston. 3/4 of venture capital is being invested in just 3 states. My home state of Ohio received less than 1%. Talent is equally distributed, but if capital continues to be concentrated in the hands of a few based on geography, we risk letting this momentum fade away. The proposals to catalyze entrepreneurship through regulatory reform are critical to not only Venture Ohio members, but also to our peers in the national startup community. And more broadly, in this new tech-based economy, these conversations will affect the entire nation. Most of the capital invested in startup companies goes toward research and development, job creation and salaries, and other expansion activities. Venture Ohio and our partners at the National Venture Capital Association know that founders, startup employees, venture capitalists, and angel investors must all find the risk-to-return ratio worthwhile in order for our entrepreneurial ecosystem to flourish. The hardworking startup founders and investors that support them, especially in America's heartland, could benefit from additional regulatory relief to reach their true potential. In particular, the Volcker Rule, aimed at preventing banks from taking unnecessary risks, should be reinterpreted. Unfortunately, it was written overly broadly and unnecessarily prevents banks from investing in venture capital funds, eliminating a critical source of capital for startups. Investors and entrepreneurs would like to see a narrower interpretation to allow banks to participate in this proven source of job creation and economic output. This regulation is especially burdensome to communities outside of major metropolitan areas, dampening entrepreneurship and economic activity where it's needed most. To be sure, positive changes are taking place. We applaud the Bipartisan Investing in Opportunity Act, which promotes investment in struggling areas with the benefit of deferred or reduced capital gains taxes. We look forward to seeing use of this opportunity proliferate in Ohio and beyond. A few targeted initiatives can positively impact capital formation for startups in the U.S., making long-term risk investment as attractive as possible. I speak for many entrepreneurs and investors when we urge Congress to create a clear and rational framework to allow America's entrepreneurial ecosystem to thrive for generations to come. Thank you very much again. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Donahue. Appreciate your testimony as well. I'd now like to introduce our third witness is Ms. Amy Gales. Ms. Gales is Executive Vice President, Regional Agribusiness Banking Group of CoBank, headquartered in Greenwood Village, Colorado. CoBank is a national cooperative bank serving vital industries across rural America and in all 50 states. Welcome, Ms. Gales, and you may begin. Thank you very much.
Good morning, Chairman Bratt, Blum, Ranking Members Evans and Snyder, and members of both subcommittees. Thank you for calling this hearing today to focus on investing in rural America. I'm Amy Gales, and I serve as Executive Vice President of the Regional Agribusiness Banking Group for CoBank. CoBank is a national cooperative bank headquartered in Denver, Colorado. Our mission is to be a dependable provider of credit and financial services to agriculture and rural infrastructure businesses for the benefit of rural America. CoBank is a proud member of the Farm Credit System, a national network of cooperative banks and lending associations chartered by Congress to support the borrowing needs of U.S. agriculture and the nation's rural economy. We are acutely aware of the capital needs of entrepreneurs in rural America and strive to find flexible and innovative ways to address those needs. We call this collectively CoBank's Growing Rural America Initiative. CoBank supports rural entrepreneurs by providing flexible loan products in the Co-op Start program, supporting the technical assistance and education needs to create new cooperatives, funding rural equity investments, financing community facilities in partnership with USDA, farm credit associations, and community banks with bond investments, sponsoring pre-development funding, financing and advocating for rural infrastructure nationwide, partnering with farm credit associations to serve young, beginning, small, and minority farmers, and supporting youth entrepreneurs. To address the capital needs of small or emerging agricultural cooperatives, CoBank developed a creative, flexible solution, Co-op Start. As consumers increased demand for local foods and other specialty crops such as hops for the growing craft brewing industry, we started to see the formation of new farmer-owned cooperatives for the purpose of distribution and marketing. The Farm Credit Administration, our independent federal regulator, maintains guidelines that we must follow in terms of safety and soundness. When the new emerging agricultural cooperatives did not meet our loan underwriting guidelines, the CoBank board proposed a solution to FCA, create a separate risk pool designed to provide more flexible financing for these cooperatives. Co-op Start was launched in 2012 to provide financing up to $250,000 to early growth stage cooperatives. As a cooperative, CoBank's commitment to foster the creation of new cooperatives runs deep through our support of numerous education and technical assistance programs. To meet the needs of food access in rural towns, CoBank recently teamed with the National Cooperative Bank to support the Food Co-op Initiative. FCI provides free technical assistance to rural communities interested in starting a food co-op, either to reopen or maintain their local grocery store. CoBank understands that rural entrepreneurs, the engine driving rural economies, need dependable sources of equity capital to improve infrastructure. They depend on this to grow their businesses. While access to senior debt is generally available, equity and junior debt remains more difficult to source. Few rural-focused investment funds exist beyond those that concentrate on acquiring farmland. Recognizing this gap and the challenges faced by rural entrepreneurs, CoBank and other farm credit associations started to make investments in equity funds focused in rural America. Rural equity investments serve as an effective source of capital to increase rural economic prosperity. These rural equity funds catalyze private capital investments and create jobs all across the country. Since 2013, CoBank has committed $52.5 million across 4 private equity funds, along with commitments by other farm credit associations, commercial and community banks, and other institutional investors. These funds are providing $300 million in equity capital to rural entrepreneurs. So far, more than 26 rural businesses have received investments from these funds. I want to thank Congress for its foresight in passing the Rural Business Investment Program legislation that has been a catalyst for the formation of rural-focused funds. The capital challenges in rural America require innovative solutions. We're proud of the partnerships and initiatives we've developed with our Growing Rural America initiative and look to find new ways to support rural America. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before the committee and for all that you do for rural America. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you for what you do as well. Thank you for your testimony, Ms. Gales. I will now yield to our ranking member, Evans, for the introduction of our final witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ross Beard is the co-founder of Village Capital, one of the most active early-stage investors in the U.S. Since its founding in 2009, Village Capital has invested in nearly 100 entrepreneurs and supports over 1,000 more through affiliate programs, such as with a particular focus on economic distressed areas. Ross is also an innovator in resident with the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation, where he focuses on issues related to access to capital for entrepreneurs, and the author of the best-selling book, The Innovative Blind Spot. He's a graduate of the University of Virginia, where he was a Jefferson Truman Scholar, and University of Oxford, where he was a Marshall Scholar. Thank you.
Thank you, ranking members. Thank you, Chairman. Thanks for the invitation to address the committee. So I'm thankful to share my experience both investing in and supporting entrepreneurs as the co-founder of Village Capital and also studying this issue in my role with the Kaufman Foundation, which supports education and entrepreneurship across the country. So today we've heard the bad news. Despite a strong stock market, entrepreneurial activity in the U.S. is actually approaching a 40-year low. Rural entrepreneurship in particular has declined 33% in the last 30 years. Now, this is a huge problem. New businesses create nearly 100% of new jobs in the country. So today I'd like to talk about the role access to capital plays. So Kauffman Foundation research estimates it costs about $30,000 to start a business. Some entrepreneurs self-fund. 67% of entrepreneurs begin their businesses with personal wealth. This is savings, second mortgages, contributions from friends and family. Yet most Americans' wealth is on the decline. In the Great Recession, 25% of Americans lost at least 75% of their wealth, most often home equity, which is a typical source of startup capital. Student debt's grown more than 100% in the last 20 years. This wealth gap's particularly wide for women, African Americans, Latinos, and rural entrepreneurs. As one entrepreneur told me over a cup of coffee at a McDonald's in Orange, Virginia, in Chairman Bratt's district last year, starting a business has become a rich man's game. So most entrepreneurs then need to access external capital, which has got two ends of the spectrum, which we talked a lot about today. On one end, small businesses have typically turned to banks, but large banks have become bigger, and small and medium-sized banks who are more likely to back new and rural businesses are disappearing. Small community banks have declined 41% since 2008. Today, only 18% of new businesses get a bank loan. We've also heard a lot today about venture capital, which is on the other end of the spectrum. It's an important tool and very valuable for a lot of businesses, but only 0.6% of businesses ever raise venture capital. It's usually a very specific type of tech company, usually in a big city. Less than 1% of venture capital goes to rural areas. So that leaves 81% of businesses stuck in between with no access to formal capital. So what do these 81% look like? 5 years ago, I met Lula Lu, a woman who founded a business called Fin Gourmet in Paducah, Kentucky. Fin Gourmet catches Asian carp, huge nuisance in the Mississippi River watershed, fillets it, rebrands it Kentucky Blue Snapper, and sells it to high-end restaurants all across the country. I'm serious. It's like Chilean sea bass is actually a muckraking bottom feeder. So when I met Lula, she earned over $100,000. She was employing 12 people, but banks said her business was too young and too risky for a loan. Venture capital says she wasn't high growth enough. And we innovated. We invested in Fin Gourmet in an innovative dividend-based model. They'd repay us a percentage of the company's revenue as they grew until we reach a predetermined return on investment. So we invested. Lula more than doubled her employment and her revenue. She still faces a lot of challenges, but there are tens of thousands of Lulas in America who are too risky for a loan and too normal for a venture capital fund. So what can Congress do for the other 81%? First, help entrepreneurs without wealth start a business. I've seen ideas, for example, focused on student debt. Entrepreneurs who start businesses and create jobs in economically distressed areas, such as opportunity zones, could have their loans deferred or forgiven based off of reaching certain benchmarks. Second, innovate in this space between equity and debt. For example, the state of Colorado helped set up a fund for rural entrepreneurs, a private sector fund. And instead of a debt or equity fund, it's this revenue-based investment, the Fin Gourmet model. Its creators argue that structure is perhaps a better fit for the majority of rural businesses. Finally, build on existing tools you've created. I'm encouraged by the recent bipartisan creation of opportunity zones across the country. Yet I'm a bit worried without a focus on, that's not us. Yet I'm a bit worried. Without a focus on entrepreneurs, I can see this being a vehicle for large real estate investment. To address this, I'm hearing from entrepreneurs about regulatory clarity that might help. As one example, it's unclear today how reinvested interim capital gains from an opportunity fund are treated. If an investor earns a return on investment from Fin Gourmet, they're more likely to invest in future Fin Gourmets if the tax incentive still applies to their interim gains if they reinvest in another entrepreneur. Also, I'm encouraging your creation support for RBICs as well as the Small Business Investment Company Fund, but I'd take a look at the possible uses of funds. SBICs, for instance, have about a $4 billion annual allocation, and amazingly, the private sector doesn't even ask for anything close to the full $4 billion each year. You literally cannot give away money you've allocated, which maybe says it's perhaps the wrong product. The SBIC fund can invest only debt. I hear from entrepreneurs and investors that the use of this fund for equity and alternative structures may expand the playing field significantly. Finally, programs such as the EDA's I-6 grant have been helpful in creating venture capital funds, and perhaps you could also accelerate the use of other innovative vehicles by expanding the mandate of private funds it could support. So we're lucky to be in an economy with good signs, but I want to remind the committee that 55% of entrepreneurs starting a business today actually think the economy is on the wrong track. If you're able to remove barriers like access to capital, a lot more entrepreneurs will be successful in realizing the American dream. Thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Very good. Thank you very much for that testimony. I guess it's on to me now for the question session. We'll go around the horn. I'll ask a question, give a sermon, and then return to the question. The question relates to the big man's game, the big firm's game, how you want to put it. I'm totally opposed to that. I taught economics for 20 years, and that's the sermon that's coming. The question will be, how has the consolidation of the banking industry impacted rural small businesses? It's kind of a softball. What key financial services are difficult to access more rural parts of the country? And how do we give small firms the real tools to compete? And so for me, I think we have a big project on our hands. You mentioned '08. Everybody's starting to go back to '08 again, right? And look in the rearview mirror. And what produced that? Risk banks no longer did risk assessment. They threw all the risk onto Fannie. And the financial crisis started only in the housing sector, right? And blew up. And you got the book on Johnson, his bio. He had 50 mini fiefdoms across all states that no politicians could touch, right? So that's the big man's game, right? And the smalls can't compete in that, and so we're losing one small bank a week, et cetera, something on that. And so if you go back to my Virginia heroes, we got Madison. You might have heard of James Madison. He's from my district. Wrote a document called the Constitution. And roughly speaking, he and Adam Smith share the exact same logic, right? So he has Enlightenment, logic. He wanted a large number of small factions duking it out against each other. A large number of small factions duking it out. What do we have in D.C. today? Big, 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 right? So we failed. We failed to stay true to that vision. Adam Smith had the exact same logic. No one knows anything about it because we don't teach economics in school anymore. But he wanted a large number of small firms competing against each other, right? That produces all the best outcomes. No one knows this, right? Everybody thinks the exact opposite is the case, that capitalism and free markets leads to profits for the big guys. So Adam Smith was exactly the opposite. There are no profits in the long run in perfect competition when you have a large number of small firms competing. And so this is kind of a setup for you, right? This is the original architecture that made this country great, made us rich. Now it's big everything, right? It's big insurance, big cars, big anything, big banking, big everything, right? And so we need your help. And if you want to really help the small firm compete, I don't think small firms can outdo and survive in the current environment. We have $2 trillion in regulatory overhang per year out of a $20 trillion economy. And so I just want to get your insights on how do we return to give the small firm, the small man, the small woman a fighting chance. Where are the key bottlenecks where we can get out of the way and take a proactive stance to return small firms to a competitive stance, right? So, I mean, you brought up trade a little bit, and that's kind of ironic too, right? So we have $2 trillion regulatory costs we put on our businesses, and the rest of the world doesn't have that yet, right? China, India, et cetera, 2 billion people, and we say go free trade. Well, that's a cynical joke, right? So go compete on a neutral playing field when you have $2 trillion regulatory disadvantage against you, and it's the same kind of argument. So I just want to tee you all up, Mr. Baird, since you started on there. What on a big level, right? I don't think we're going to get to where we all want in returning power to the states and localities and small businesses without some major steps. What do you think some of those major steps are? And banking industry consolidation.
Sure.
That's part of it. Fire away.
Sure. I'm also from Virginia, and I'll start with another Virginia hero, Thomas Jefferson, who's not in your district but close by. There was a big debate between Jefferson and Hamilton at the founding of the Republic on Jefferson says, do we design the economy for producers? And Hamilton, do we design the economy for financiers and consumers? And the producers won, and probably rightly so. And I think over the last 30 to 40 years, we've seen a major shift in how government defines competition, which says so long as prices are low and profits are high, the economy is competitive. And I think we've seen, whether it's in the chicken industry or the pork industry or the banking industry or cable or airlines, we've seen massive consolidation, and it's very, very difficult for small businesses to compete all across the board. And I think these are intentional policy questions. So, for example, this Congress passed probably 70 years ago a bill called Robinson-Patman that actually protected small producers against large producers and was very, very good for rural areas. Robinson-Patman is still on the books today, but when a large quasi-monopoly puts a small producer out of business, the courts have said that prices are low, it doesn't matter, even though it's technically against congressional statute. So I would say think about ways to promote and protect specific producers. Some of this is looking at large tech platforms that are both running platforms and selling things on the platforms, and I know you have a number of different hearings and questions about that. Some of that is ways to look at banking and financing and having different capital controls for smaller and larger banks. I can go into more detail, but that's kind of the intellectual framework I'd look at it if I were you.
Great, thanks. I think we'll go around the horn once and maybe get back to that for the rest of the panel as well. We'll go to our ranking member, Mr. Evans, for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bear, you raised an issue that I was just dealing with last week. If you ever get to Philadelphia in Roxborough, there's a place called Le Bus. Got some of the best food. But there's a woman who's been running a business for 13 years. You stated in your written testimony that business lending is outdated when it comes to service businesses, with many assets used as collateral. How can banks' lending be restructured to allow more small service industry to access the need to start up or expand? That's exactly her issue. When I'm listening to you, she's been in for 13 years. She went out and she bought another restaurant, didn't do well, had to sell that restaurant, and she's struggling because of the very same issue you're talking about. So talk about, from that big picture standpoint, if that model is a failed model, what do you see?
Sure. In my conversations with larger banks, the minimum loan size that's profitable for a larger bank to underwrite is about $250,000. Now, going back to the Kaufman research, it takes about $30,000 to start up a business. That means most people are far too small to matter. So there's a issue that banks were created in a day where most businesses were goods businesses. You buy a big machine and you get a loan, and if the business goes under, you can reclaim the machine, and that's your collateral. Today, most businesses are services businesses, like the business that you described. So the industry has changed and banking hasn't. One of the things that we have the opportunity to look at, though, is the role of technology in making lending off of cash flows rather than lending off of assets. So, for example, we invest in a company in Houston called Fig Loans. That's in Houston's the payday lending capital of the world. And Fig Loans is a couple of numbers data scientists who have developed an algorithm to actually predict what a small business's cash flow might be. And they actually lend off of the potential of the business, even if the business is 9 months. They have a number of data pieces that go into it, and they have a predictive algorithm, and they're able to dramatically compete with payday lenders. So I would say there are technologies that help us look at cash flows. There are also regulations that may have different, again, capital controls, on balance, off balance. We want to manage risk, but many of these smaller banks and startup financial services technology companies are doing forward-looking cash flow lending rather than backward-looking asset lending, which is more in touch with most businesses starting today, I think.
Banks will then turn around and blame people like us in Congress and regulators for why they cannot do what you have said, because there's a certain amount of money they need to keep in the bank. What's your response to that when they turn and blame us?
Well, you recently passed a bill that loosened controls significantly that were put in for Dodd-Frank. And one of the things I would keep an eye on at this committee is banks have said for a while that they haven't been able to lend because of these controls. So you loosen regulations. I would hold them accountable. I would say, we did what you told us to do. Are you actually lending to rural businesses, small businesses? So in some ways, you've removed an excuse, and I would hold banks accountable to make sure they do what they said they were going to do before you remove the excuse.
Ms. Gill, you mentioned in your written testimony that one of the companies you supported is an American company who regularly relies on exports for their business model. Are you worried that the administration tafts on our neighbors and biggest trading partners? Are these companies worried? And what are we going to do to give certainty and support to this trade-stressed time?
We're absolutely very concerned about trade, as our industry of agriculture is very reliant on exporting to get fair prices. We're very good at production agriculture, and so it is very important for us to be able to sell products abroad. Most of our products we cannot consume totally in the United States, so we really rely on that market. So I'll say we are looking at it very, very closely. We're working with our customers very, very closely, and reminding the panel that in good times and bad, the Farm Credit System is there to work with our financial partners. So we're keeping a keen eye on it. Would have to say we're worried about what that's going to do to impact cash flows of the businesses that we finance.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Rod Blum for his questions.
Thank you, Chairman Bratt. Mr. Baird, you said in your testimony entrepreneurship's at a 40-year low, and this, to me, is stunning, and I can't believe it. 55% of entrepreneurs think the economy is on the wrong track. I don't buy it. Tell me why I should.
So I think that there is a increasing dichotomy, to Chairman Bratt's point, between big and small. And I think that largely older firms, and when I say entrepreneurs, this is a Kauffman Foundation survey from February, and we look at businesses that are fewer than 5 years old. So that's the technical definition. So the vast majority of businesses that are older than 5 years old think the economy is on the right track. 55% of businesses that are fewer than 5 years old think the economy is on the wrong track. And I think it's because it's very difficult for small businesses to compete against large businesses for a number of reasons.
Nobody said it was easy. I did it.
So did I. No, I understand.
It's not easy.
It's incredibly difficult. But I think there has been, for example, if you are in any range of industries, advertising is a large source of revenue for many types of business, media or whatever it is. 10 years ago, the advertising industry was very much divvied up. Today, 85% of online advertising is owned by two companies, Google and Facebook. And you have to build something on someone else's platform, and then they have the ability to shut you down. So I think there's a increasing sense that large businesses are both making the rules and using the rules to compete against you if you're an entrepreneur. This is something I hear over and over again. And you hear it in the agricultural supply chain trying to compete with increasing conglomerates. You hear it in financial services.
The converse of that, though, is 2 weeks ago we had in here folks that were on Amazon's platform, and they were all small businesses between $500,000 a year in revenues to up to $12 million a year, selling on Amazon and Etsy and eBay. So conversely, those are, yes, they're big. Those are big companies, but they're platforms for entrepreneurs.
So I think that the question to ask if I'm on your committee is, what are the rules for platforms? So, for example, Amazon as compared to eBay. On eBay, I wrote a book. I can't control the price on Amazon, and it goes up and down, and I don't understand why that is. On eBay, if I sell my book for $30, no one will buy it. If I sell it for 99 cents, people will buy it, but I'll lose money. But I get to choose. And so I think that the question of, do people competing on a platform have choice over how to take their product to market is a really important one.
Thank you. And I did mention during that hearing that Amazon needs competition.
They do.
And when we get into sectors of industries when there's not enough competition, then that's where we have problems.
That's right.
Typically. Mr. McKenna, consolidation in the farming industry, not the banking industry, good thing or bad thing? And is it being driven by only the large farms can get credit and the small? I mean, I'm 63. I can remember when your average farmer would farm 80 acres or 160 acres. Today in Iowa, I don't meet a farmer that's farming less than 1,200 acres. And I know the investments are bigger and the capital needs are probably higher. Do you think it's a good thing or a bad thing? Farms are consolidating and getting bigger.
From a venture capital perspective, I think it's probably a pretty good thing in the sense that it creates a platform under which entrepreneurs, new people, new technologies, smart ideas can bloom. And the demand for technology, the demand for innovation is as great as it ever has been. Who are going to come up with those ideas? Who are going to be the people that develop those ideas? Big companies, big farms, it may be below their radar. On the other hand, there is a lot of smart people, a lot of innovation coming out of our land grant system, coming out of smart people's garages that are invited to participate with these larger consumers, with the larger enterprises. So from a venture capital perspective, I think bigness is perhaps a fact of life. On the other hand, there is still the opportunity for the smaller firms. There's still the opportunity for the young new person to create a new business. That new business may not be able to compete on an agriculture basis, but may compete on a technology basis, may compete on a logistics basis, may compete on some part of the economic chain that the big farms are following. And that's where the innovation that I'm seeing. I'm seeing innovation below that level of the big farm, below big ag.
If we go back 8 years, let's say 2008, 2010, I can recall, I think Warren Buffett was very interested in the agriculture markets. They were saying the hottest trends in Silicon Valley was now agriculture and precision farming, if you can recall that. Prices were also high back then for commodities. So, but is this a price-driven thing? If we can increase the prices of the commodities through trade, will all the money flow back in then to this marketplace?
Certainly, a rising tide will float a lot of boats. That's certainly the case. But also, look at the small businesses can't compete from a fixed capital perspective. In other words, a farm today needs a certain size, needs a certain amount of land, needs a certain amount of equipment, and that's expensive. On the other hand, if a small business is technology-based or software-based, the capital invested there is a relatively smaller number, and that creates the opportunity for the entrepreneur. What I see the opportunity for the financial side is funding those people, is funding those smaller ideas. And I still think there's a world of opportunity for those smaller ideas.
Thank you. I yield back the time I do not have.
Thank you, Mr. Blum. I'd like to recognize Mr. Schneider for his questions.
Thank you, and I want to thank the witnesses again for sharing your perspectives, and the chairman for allowing us to have this actually very important hearing. Mr. Baird, you touched on the struggle between the Jeffersonians and the Hamiltonians at the founding of our nation, and it was. Yeah, fair enough. But it was an important debate at the time. But at the time, we were an agricultural economy. Over the 240 years since that debate, we have gone from agriculture to industry to a knowledge economy, and increasingly to a services economy. And Mr. McKenna, you touched on, I think, very importantly, that agriculture has gone from the small plot of land to a high-tech, high-investment industry that you need scale. And so my question broadly is if we look at the opportunities taking place, and I'll pick on the 3 states, New York, Massachusetts, and California, where venture capital is going, a lot of these ideas are started at low scale in garages. People just with a computer and an idea are able to create something that can grow into a fabulous business. There's no reason that can't be done anywhere in the country. And Ms. Donahue, you talked about talent being equally distributed. It may be at birth, but by the time they go to school and they are these ecosystems that are developing in these concentrated metropolitan areas. So my broad question is, how do we use this very same technology that is in many ways creating this concentration to deconcentrate and allow businesses that need access to capital, that need access to talent, but can't succeed with the opportunity, without the opportunity for scale, to gain capital, gain talent, and achieve scale while staying in smaller rural communities? And I'll open up to the panel.
Sure, I'll give a quick answer and then turn it over to folks. I think there are, thanks for the question. I think there are a lot of things that government tries to do in startups, like create funds and things like that, that government's not particularly good at. Picking specific winners and losers is not a core competency of government, I think. But there are 2 things that government, I think, has done well, particularly in rural areas in the past. The first is infrastructure. So my mom lives on a farm in Cumberland County, Virginia, just south of your district, and my wife and I, when we go there, it's great because we don't do any work, but we can't do work because they don't have broadband because there's no internet there. And I think that that's a huge barrier, and that's the next generation of the Rural Electrification Act or the Interstate Highway Act is something around rural broadband. And the second, I want to go back to market competition. So, scale is great if buyers and sellers are all treated equally. Right now in the chicken industry or the pork industry, there's basically one buyer, which means farmers can't compete for better prices. So some of this is technology. There are tech platforms that don't treat all buyers and sellers equally. Some of it is market platforms. I think making sure that free market competition rules happen in markets infrastructure is a core competency of Congress.
Ms. Gill.
I'd like to take a crack at that. On the broadband comment that you have, I think there really is a role for government and private entities to work together. And CoBank finances communications. But when you start getting into a rural area where the density does not allow a return on a significant investment, we run into the same problems when we go home, or I go home to my rural farm where I was raised in southeast Minnesota, and you really don't have good broadband coverage. So when we start looking at what are some possible solutions to that, the Universal Service Fund reform, I think, has to have some changes. And the Rural Broadband Loan and Grant Program, I think, is also important as a way for government and private entities to work together. So rebuilding our broadband and making it attractive for our young people to stay in rural areas, as well as to have agriculture. We've been talking about agriculture, and the Farm Credit System provides 40% of the capital to agriculture. And so it's very important. How do we run precision agriculture? How do we turn on a tractor that drives itself? How do we look at other things such as telemedicine so that we can have the same kind of care that we have in urban settings, that we can have that same kind of care in rural settings? So I think there's a big room for private-public partnerships.
Ms. Donahue.
Building ecosystems are complex, and it just takes time. I know in Ohio we're doing a lot of the right things, but we're so much newer than Silicon Valley or Boston or New York. Public-private partnerships are a very important piece of this, including building infrastructure and access to the internet. I think our corporations have a large role to play, leaning in and supporting these entrepreneurs, providing customer validation and using their products. I think the government could could lean in that way as well, and be the first customer for startup companies and entrepreneurs. They're not looking for a handout, they're looking for a hand up, and I think that's one way that the government could contribute.
Great. And if I may request time for Mr. McKenna. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. And I would go back to the comment from Chairman Brad about, I like the expression, the competition of a large number of small firms. The rural business investment companies, the RBICs that Congress authorized and USDA administers, are a tremendous success. Giving them access to the leverage provided by the Small Business Administration would be a great benefit as well. And that's pending before the House Senate conference right now as part of the Farm Bill. So I would urge you to consider giving them that access.
Great. Thank you. And I'm out of time. I'll yield back.
Great, thank you, and I'd like to now yield time to Mr. Lawson for his questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to the committee. And Ms. McKenna and I was interested when they say you was from Georgetown. I was wondering what kind of rural development you have around Georgetown. But I do know you've had the opportunity to work with people down south, and so and I would like to know. How did you get involved with that research to work with the people, when you're from Georgetown? Do you really know what's going on down there? How can you help them with the research and so forth that you're doing in terms of economic development and small business growth?
Georgetown, you're absolutely right. Georgetown barely has a campus, let alone an agricultural footprint. But they recognize that there's an opportunity to be a doorkeeper, so to speak, for other organizations to Washington, D.C. And in the rural space, they feel there's a need for that access to Washington, D.C. to advance rural issues. Obviously, they need partners, and that's why we've reached out to the campuses, land-grant campuses in Mississippi State, Purdue, and Iowa State, because they obviously have that skill, that expertise, and the desire to address those needs. So the Center at Georgetown University relies upon our partners, USDA and those 3 land-grant schools, to be the place where the ideas come up, where the needs are identified, discussed, and then brought to the proper forum in Washington, D.C. to be discussed.
Okay, and next up, Ms. Donahue, how do you keep the character of rural communities intact with economic development? I tell you that I grew up in a rural community, and when things start drying up, developers start selling property, and a lot of people moved in. And then a lot of people start saying, we don't even know these people on the commission now. They started incorporating their cities. You know, I had a lot to do with some of it in Florida legislature. But how you keep the integrity of the community, and someone else might want to comment on it too, about infrastructure, the character of the communities at the same time increasing economic development.
I think that's a very important topic. We love our friends in San Francisco, but are very wary of how that city has developed. So inclusive economic development is very important in how we build these communities and these ecosystems. I can tell you that in Ohio, we've been able to maintain character by repurposing a lot of the old buildings, the old structures, job retraining, job creation, and bringing people from industries that are outdated and training them for the jobs of the future is something that's very important to us in Ohio.
Okay, and Ms. Gill, do you think about that when you giving loans and so forth to these developers in those communities?
We absolutely do, and there's no corner on the market of good ideas in urban areas. There's many good ideas in rural areas, and oftentimes it seems what is needed is technical support so that we can work with people. I worked with a cooperative development center for 3 years in South Dakota, and there was no shortage of good ideas. But that technical assistance is so important to put the business plan together, to make sure that it fits with the community's desires, that it fits as without changing the character of the community. I mean, whatever the factors are that are important to the people with a good idea. So I think technical assistance is really a very important part of making successful businesses get off the ground in the best possible fashion.
Mr. Bayer?
Yeah, I think a lot of this is the design of the types of and tools of capital. So, you know, it's the saying, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Venture capital funds are a great fit for high growth technology companies. There may be other kinds of investments that are better fit for rural businesses, and innovations like the fish company I told you about, the investment structure we used. I can see an opportunity to identify and scale, and maybe government can help seed some of those efforts. The second thing I'd say is to your question around developers in real estate, I'm very encouraged by and supportive of opportunity zones, and with the caveat that there's a world in which it is a real estate developer only benefit, and there's a world in which entrepreneurs and small businesses are at the center of it. There are a couple of questions around how gains from opportunity funds can be used, how and whether opportunity funds can raise and utilize debt that would make it much more entrepreneur friendly. So I encourage Congress to listen to entrepreneurs as regulatory clarity comes out in opportunity zones to make sure the entrepreneurs in the communities benefit.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could have just a few more seconds. Mr. Bayer, you said that there are always a lot of money left on the table. You know, I've only been up here about 17 months. What do you mean by the money left on the table?
So the Small Business Investment Company Fund out of SBA is a fund of funds that seeds funds across America like we all are excited about. It makes money for the government. It was $2 billion. A few years ago, you extended it to $4 billion, but the private sector doesn't ever come close to asking for that $4 billion because it's a debt investment vehicle. And most risk capital are either equity funds or quasi-equity funds like the Fin Gourmet idea. And so no one wants to raise debt and then on-invest equity. And if you're raising senior debt, as Ms. Gale said, it's actually relatively straightforward and much easier to raise. So I think changing clarifications on how the SBIC funds could use, I think would be a lot more responsive to the private sectors as one strategy you might pursue.
Okay, thank you. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I think maybe we can do a short lightning round. I'll just make a couple comments. Ms. Gales, your comments on technical assistance, I think very interesting and provocative. Having taught freshman economics for 20 years, I always ask myself, what would the world look like if we taught our K-12 kids about business ahead of time, right? So they start doing internships and being creative and looking at technical assistance early on in life, right, while they're in high school even. And then they move on to business certificates and technical education, all that, and they're working on that the whole time, right? The kids coming out of K-12 right now, it's not the fault of the teacher. They don't know what a business is at all, right? I mean, they don't know a price, a cost, a profit, zip. So that we've spent 13 years, $14,000 per year, and that's what we got. And then colleges, some of them are hostile to business and free markets, et cetera. So if you want to make a dent, I think there's a lot of resources in those channels. We could turn the world around. It'd take it's like turning a battleship around, but we could turn the world around. And then finally, I kind of gave my little architecture there with Smith and Madison or whatever, but I want to give a cautionary note on when you come up here on the opportunity zones, real estate, whatever. And same thing, it kind of has to do with the kids. We got $4 trillion that comes up here, right? $20 trillion economy, $4 trillion comes up here. And then who controls that pot? The small guys, right? So everybody knows, right? And so that's the tricky part, is how do you keep these things from getting gamed and captured? And there's economic literature on all this stuff. And so clearest example for me, right? We get 21 trillion in debt right now. We got 100 trillion in unfunded liabilities. And who that's going to affect who? The one major group in our country that has no lobbyists, the kids. So that's just a cautionary note on working up here instead of keeping it down there, or whatever we write up here, better send it all back home, right, to the states and localities, et cetera. And so I kind of started the last section on what can we do on a big scale. And I got to Mr. Baird and Mr. McKenna and Ms. Donahue, Ms. Gales, if either of you want to weigh in on what we can do better big time, right? Not just on this issue, but overall to have the government be a fair broker as we try to adjudicate between these groups who have been left behind.
I'd comment on rural youth. We've got a lot of blue jackets in the room, and rural and urban youth are going to be the future of our United States. And so you start looking at what are some of the opportunities for youth. And there's so many great projects like Campus Kitchen Program, or I look at what 4-H is doing, the other organization that I was a part of, but Scouting for Food, Campus Kitchens have been a real success. So I look at not only technical assistance, but how are we working with youth who are the entrepreneurs or future entrepreneurs that are really going to help us do a better job bringing capital and ideas and keeping them in rural America.
It is very difficult to get a first-time venture capital fund off of the ground. Less than 100 are created every year. That is especially difficult in the Midwest. Lifting the Volcker rule, I think, would be very important and have a significant impact on the Midwest. Prior to the Volcker rule, banks played a very critical role in the creation of venture capital funds in Ohio. We don't have the stacked LP base that our partners on the coast do. We're very limited as to the number of institutional investors who can invest in venture capital and who are educated on venture capital. So banks not only made up a significant amount of the fund, they were the first investor in providing confidence for subsequent investors. So for us in Ohio, the Volcker rule is very critical.
Just repeating what I said before, the opportunity for small venture capital funds exists. They're out there. They just need a little bit of push. And most of that push is going to come from the private sector. But from a SBA perspective, having the RBICs gain a little bit of access there would be, I think, a helpful push.
Great. Mr. Evans,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
anyone else that wants a second crack?
Can you, I'm going to follow up with Ms. Gill. You mentioned in your testimony that co-banking is working with minority groups and farmers to help them get a leg up in agriculture. What types of programs are they doing, and who are you working with to ensure that everyone is getting fair access to capital?
Thank you for the question. We work with our farm credit partners who are responsible for working with small, beginning, and startup companies and minority companies. And so we have a program that I'd like to just highlight called Farm Start that is in our East Coast office that we work with our Farm Credit East Farm Credit Partner and Yankee Farm Credit Partner in Vermont and Massachusetts. And so they identify small, beginning, new farmers, minority farmers that need some additional help, and we support that program with some equity capital. They make the analysis, that they're the farm lenders, they make the analysis on the loan product that we provide. But there's another program where we don't follow traditional underwriting standards in many cases to give those individuals a leg up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bear, I want to go back to something I heard you mention. This followed to Mr. Lawson. Could you discuss the potential problem created if the opportunity zones are used for real estate investment only? I heard Mr. Lawson raise some questions about opportunity zones.
Yes, thank you, Congressman. I think that this goes back to a theme of this, which has been the big versus small. So opportunity zones investment, I like it a lot because it's private sector totally. It's no government capital, so it's the private sector driving it. However, today the way that the regulations are interpreted, you have to, if you sell a stock, if you own stock and then want to invest in an opportunity zone, you have to sell it and invest it within 6 months. And that, the larger the investment, the bigger tax benefit you get. So it's a lot easier to invest it in a $10 million real estate project than $250,000 growth equities in small entrepreneurs. And so we are seeing communities. I was just in Central Valley of California. We're seeing farm communities collect and syndicate groups of small investments, and that's the kind of thing the private sector is doing, which is encouraging. But right now, the way regulations are interpreted, it's a lot easier to invest in one big project than a number of small entrepreneurs that are trying to compete in the economy. There are a number of potentially. I think that the idea of opportunity zones is to create economic dynamism in economically distressed areas. And if you invest in real estate only without investing in businesses that are creating jobs, creating growth, creating churn, it's unlikely that you'll see net economic activity. And so and I've put this in my testimony, there are a couple of open questions on regulatory clarity that would be very, very helpful for small entrepreneurs that we keep hearing from the field that I'd take a look at.
Mr. Schneider, any further questions?
Yes, thank you. I want to go back to this idea of creating ecosystems or environments where entrepreneurs can achieve success. Last year, I introduced AOSA, the Accelerator Startups Act. The idea is to invest in these incubators and accelerators, particularly in communities, whether it's rural or economically distressed communities. I'd love your perspective on what impact that might have of having incubators, of having places where entrepreneurs, small businesses can come, learn from each other, get resources, besides just access to capital, but resources of understanding how to read a P&L or how to reach a new market.
I would take a look at the land-grant system. I mean, every land-grant school I've visited has a environment, a room, a building that encourages that. And whether they call them accelerators or incubators or regional investment councils, that feeling is present in every land-grant campus that I've been to. And it's often staffed by a professor, by a team. Sometimes that team is funded partly for the USDA funding, sometimes it's funded through state funding, but it's an incredibly valuable tool. It's on a university. The university has access to R&D, and it marries both the technological side and also the investment side. So I think the land grants hit the ball out of the park as far as that's concerned.
Density is a critical component of a healthy entrepreneurial ecosystem. Getting all the entrepreneurs in the room together, they can feed off of each other, the energy, the excitement, teach each other new things, and just offer a support system is very important. Also bringing in those mentors, and to my point earlier about us just being kind of new, we don't have a lot of mentors. We don't have a large number of people who have successfully grown and exited a tech company or whatever, life sciences company or whatever it may be. So I think we need a lot of time, but getting mentors from all over the country and bringing them to smaller areas, parts of Ohio, teaching them the ropes and how they were able to achieve success in California, I think could be great. I love the program. I love the idea.
I also believe the co-op business model plays a role with a long-term perspective And cooperative development centers across the United States have been very instrumental in helping those cooperatives get started, whether it is a food cooperative, some sort of a technology type of cooperative. I mean, there's many places where that type of model really is worthwhile. And so I look at, again, what's the technical assistance, getting people together, coming up with ideas, understanding best practices, knowing where to find capital. There's just so much information that a young entrepreneur needs to start a business. And I think the cooperative business model is one area that can serve a very important purpose.
Mr. Baird, last word to you.
Yep. So I had not heard of AOSA, but Congressman, I think it's the right idea. I mean, one of the things in my role at the Kauffman Foundation, I've looked at all kinds of government funding to try and increase access to capital, and the evidence is pretty clear that direct funding of businesses from the government actually doesn't provide good outcome. It's kind of neutral. People in Ohio or people in Indiana are better placed to decide who to support and incubate and invest in businesses than people here or New York or Silicon Valley. And so things like the EDA I-6 grant, which seeds fund managers instead of investing directly in businesses, has had good outcomes. Things like investing in incubators, accelerators, Ms. Donahue's stat that fewer than 100 new venture funds each year are starting, I think that's probably a contributor to the lack of economic dynamism because you don't have people close to businesses being able to support those businesses. So Congressman, I'm encouraged by that line of thought and encouraged to hear about your thinking on that. I think you're on the right track and the evidence would support it.
Great. Thank you. I yield back.
All right, Mr. Lawson.
Thank you very much. I keep hopping on Georgetown. They got a new coach over there. I hope he does well. Yeah. How can we help universities partner with rural community development? You hear presidents oftentimes, talk about this area, but how can we help them to close the skill gaps? What can we do to encourage the universities to close the skill gap and so that many industries can prosper?
The example I've seen that has been successful, I think, is what the Department of Agriculture does, and through their regional community development program, where they have teamed up with 4 land-grant schools and divided the country into a series of sectors where those schools lead local regional economic development activities. A little bit of money comes from the federal government, not very much, but it's enough to create a very vibrant local examination of those issues. And I agree with the comments before. Not much happens in Washington as far as that traction is concerned. The traction has to take place in the local community where they know what the businesses are, they know where the economic demand is. And the more situations where the money can flow down to those organizations, land grant, there's others, but land grant's an example that's up and running, the better, I think.
Anyone else care to comment?
I'll comment that I think private industry also has a role in that. In the case of CoBank, we have partnerships with universities, primarily land-grant universities, since we're rural-focused, where we're working together to identify where are those needs and how can we work together and also put money where our mouth is.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask one more question?
Yeah, sure, you bet.
Mr. Baird, you mentioned about Dodd-Frank, and it was a great deal of discussion about whether you help the small commercial banks and credit union with the undue regulation. And I think in your testimony you stated that if we move some of the regulation, then we need to hold their feet to the fire for what they said. Can you comment on that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I think that obviously macroeconomics is very complicated, and I think that there are very sophisticated arguments on both sides of the recent bill you passed, as well as Dodd-Frank. But the legislation that's passed, the argument, at least from small and medium-sized banks, was if you pass this, we will lend more to small businesses, and I would keep an eye on that. I mean, it remains to be seen whether this is the right or the wrong legislative decision. I think it's not my role to comment on that, but I do think that if banks say pass this and we will help small businesses more, you should gather evidence and ask questions and invite people to a hearing like this for a follow-up of, we did this. Are you doing what you said you would do?
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
I like the gather evidence part. All right. I want to thank you all for being here. I think we're all very happy with the way this went today. Tomorrow, the New York Times, the headline, I'm sure, will be Republicans and Democrats united with a great panel of articulate hosts, all in favor of helping the small guy, the small gal, the small firm. It was all good news, right? Good news never makes the paper. It is that's what's wrong, right? I mean, we got to make sure that make the paper someday, right? So I want to thank my Democrats. There was 3 in here versus 1 at one time, and I'm walking out of here smiling. So it's a good day up in D.C. So with that, I'll ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to submit statements supporting materials for the record. Without objection, so ordered. This hearing is now adjourned. Thank you all very much. Like that one? That's good. That's good. Good news.